Well, hey there. Welcome back to the Uncovered Dish Christian Leadership Podcast, the podcast that uncovers stories, equips leaders, and changes the world. And we are your hosts, James Lee.
Gabby Corbett.
And today we have a very, very special guest with us, the Reverend Dr. Georgia Thompson. Reverend Thompson is a groundbreaking leader. She became the first woman and the first Black woman to serve as general minister and president in the United Church of Christ. Born in Jamaica, she came to the United States and has been with the UCC since 2009, serving in various leadership roles. Reverend Thompson holds a doctorate in ministry from Seattle University with a dissertation in religious multiplicity among African Caribbean people. She holds a MDiv from Union Theological Seminary and a Master of Public Administration from North Carolina Central University. Reverend Thompson, we're so glad that you're here with us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's just dive right into the first question. So, Reverend Thompson, how would you describe your theology or philosophy of leadership? And what models or mentors do you draw on for wisdom as a leader in the church?
I don't know so much that I have a theology of leadership as maybe I have a philosophy of leadership. One, I believe that we're called to places for a season. A season may be 15 years. It could be 1 month. But that where we're called to lead, that's where we show up. And I also believe that essential to leadership is integrity and authenticity, right? So sometimes we overstay, which is the season thing, right? The season part of it, that we're called for a season. The second thing is that we should be able to show up with our whole selves, right? And integrity and authenticity, I think, are sometimes challenging, particularly for people who tend to be underrepresented in our demographically challenged society, which tends to, in the church, still be white male dominated, right? So you feel that you have to be a certain way, you have to speak a certain way, maybe show up in a certain kind of way. But I believe that leadership comes from an authentic place that reflects the fullness of who we are. And I think if we can find our way into that place, that we become effective leaders, because if there's a philosophy, it's that leaders are made. They're not, you know what I mean? Like we don't create leaders. That leadership comes from an authentic place, and it comes from self-knowledge. And the more that you dare to know about yourself, the better you are as a leader. Otherwise, you tend to project. So that being centered is important. I would say one of my role models definitely was James Cone, who I had as a professor at Union in New York. And one of the things that he said that I will never forget, our first day of systematic theology, he said, theology is God talk, right? And in that, we are all theologians. And so if I were to talk about this, theology of leadership, I think that it's really conversations about leadership that include God talk. And for me, when we talk about the church, that would mean for me that understanding that God calls us, and that we're called into those places for a season, and that we're called to show up with our authentic selves, believing that we are there for those who are there for that time.
I love that. And when I think of James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree was a book most of us read in seminary. And I always think about the quote where he talks about there's no universality without particularity. And I'm curious, how has your particular context and your particular calling and season, as you put it right now, as the UCC general minister and president, shaped the way that you see the church? What do you see going on in churches in the United States today? What are some of the opportunities and what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things about me, I was not born in this country. I was born in the Caribbean. And so my view tends to be shaped from a global context always. And I believe that ministry has to be global, meaning globally focused, but locally rooted. And so I believe that's how I see this season in the United Church of Christ. I think that a part of the challenge in the U.S. is our focus on the decline, the numerical decline in the church. I think the opportunity that it presents for us is to really think about what it means for the church to be impacting in the world, right? So our numbers are shrinking in the pews, but I think that our impact is still pretty distinct when we think about the ways in which many of our local congregations, regardless of size, are functioning in very creative ways to assist, whether it's with food pantries, homelessness, mentoring programs, tutoring programs. Some are doing Alzheimer's and elderly programs. So I think that we need a shift to thinking about impact and less so about how many people are showing up on Sunday morning, because I think that Sunday morning may be 1/8 of the work that the church is doing, because I do believe in that 8th day of the week, right? That we all try to create, right? So it's really just a small fraction of all the things that we're doing. So why not begin to rethink and reimagine the church at work in the world, rather than, I think, focusing rather negatively on what is happening? Because I would say that the perceptions around shrinkage have always been there, because it's a part of the way that we've historically done our demographics. How often have we heard, and I've heard this across denomination, well, we have X number of people on the books, X minus 50 show up on Sunday morning, and X minus 100, right, are actually active in the church. But we start from an aspirational place if we're talking about X, right? And then it declines from there. So how, can we talk about that in a different kind of way that says that our church has a particular impact that is, X cubed, or, X minus 50 cubed. I'm sorry, it's my engineering brain. Can we talk about that differently, and then talk about impact versus what is not showing up on Sunday morning? Because I think if we told a different story, we would be able to realize, I think, a much different experience of church in this particular moment.
Yeah, I think that is so powerful. And I think that that's so countercultural to what we have been doing for so long, which I think is, what we need more countercultural thinking through if we want to be saved, right? As everyone keeps talking about, saving the mainline denominations.
Yeah.
But I want to go back really quick to, you said something that was also very powerful about authenticity. And showing up, and that leadership is so important. Authenticity is so important to how we lead. And a lot of people aren't hearing that story, right? A lot of folks who are in seminary, a lot of folks who are in other leadership modules are being told that they need to fit in a particular kind of mold. Mm-hmm. And so for those folks who are trying to figure out what authenticity means to them, where would you give somebody advice to start? How do you find your most authentic self that can show up in this really wonky, beautiful, but sometimes really broken thing that we call church?
Yeah, I think we ought to start with our shadow side. That most often, I think we want to start with what is most acceptable, what is more palatable to others, right? And quite often, I think our authenticity comes out of the very fears that we have for ourselves, because there's usually a reason why we experience parts of ourselves in a negative way. Oftentimes, it's the messages that we've ingested about ourselves. For me, it was about being a woman, right? And coming out of a denominational context, because I was not always UCC, coming out of a denominational context that said that women were supposed to be silent in the church. Women were not in leadership. And so even answering the call to ministry was hard because it was not something that I experienced readily for myself. And so, I think those kinds of messages begin to create the fear because then it's, am I going to find a church? Is this really the call for me? And I think that there are other ways that society presents to us messages about ourselves that have us believing that there's something wrong with who we are. And I think when we can figure out beyond the what is wrong with us, right? So whatever it is, that thing is that you think is so wrong about yourself, start there. You know what I mean? And begin to own that for yourself. I could name, a multiplicity of other things. And I think that where it leads us is to thinking that there's always the one more thing that we could do or that we should do, whether it's more education or another certificate, right? We start to try to find ways to fix or refine who we are, right? When that just kind of takes you on a road away from yourself. So where is the most comfortable place for you in the skin that you're in? Like, what is that? Right? And then work from there, debunking the myths that have been ingested and finding our way into that place that's authentic. Because I think that our most authentic place is the place that attracts the people who need the message that we bring. Right? So not being ourselves means that there's somebody out there who needs us, who's not finding themselves because we're missing in the narrative, right? So our place in the narrative becomes most important, I think, for calling and ministry. And I believe that if God called us, God knew exactly who we were, right? Faults and flaws. And so that's the thing that's needed in the moment for ministry. But usually that's where we start to hide, right?
Yeah. I love hearing a mainline denominational leader say things like finding your most authentic self, starting with your shadow side. The world needs the things that we find most difficult about ourselves, that we should look at our impact and not our numbers. I think that this is so important to what it looks like to be the church in the coming years and the coming decade. So I just want to say thank you for saying the things, because I think these are conversations some of us are having on smaller scales, but to be able to hear a mainline denominational leader say those things out loud is so powerful and gives me such hope for where we're headed in the next couple of years.
Reverend Thompson, you wrote a book titled Drums in Our Veins, and you talk about resistance poetry. And just wanted to hear what came about to inspire you to write this book, and how rhythms and your experiences, your background shaped who you are as a leader and how you teach about leadership.
For me, poetry was something that was about getting things out of my head. And it got to a point where I had probably hundreds, heading into over 1,000 poems that were just like sitting around my house. A part of finding my authentic self was actually about seeing the value to my poetry as an expression of who I am. I believe now that our creativity is very much a part of our spirituality, and that our ability to hone our creative self is as important as the academic work that we do. And there's some of us who dance and sing and paint and play instruments, and they become secondary or tertiary in the pursuit for a career. I know colleagues who used to play instruments and don't play them anymore because they don't have time, or because they took up some kind of career where that wasn't used, right? You all know, ministers who play the drums and the guitar and the piano, but it's something that they do on Sunday morning to support ministry, right? And so it became important for me to give some kind of focus to the work that I was doing and to how I understood it. And so when I started looking at publishing this particular book of poetry, it was really about validating in some way the gift, because I see creativity also as a gift, and gifts are given to us not for ourselves, but for community. And so I had to wrestle with the fact that I had been given this wonderful gift that I had been tucking in books and storing in trunks for years, and saying, this is important and as important as other work that I was doing. The resistance part of it is that a lot of my poetry comes from myself, right? That means it comes from being Black, it comes from being a woman, it comes from a place of understanding oppression, it comes from a place of understanding myself as a descendant of enslaved people who were part of the transatlantic slave trade. It comes from the lived reality of experiencing microaggressions with regularity. And so the writing became a part of my own resistance to oppression, writing about this in terms of experiences that I had, but also writing from a place of hope. And so when I created this, it was also about understanding that the journey is about the rhythms, and writing is about rhythm. And the title actually came from a conversation that I had with my mother one day, who said to me, I was explaining to her about, I have this thing for Portuguese music. I don't understand it. I don't understand Portuguese. I love Brazilian music. And so I was explaining to her, I keep listening to this stuff. I don't understand it. And that I thought it was the beat of the drums. It has, very, deep Afro rhythms. And so she said, her response was that when she was growing up, they would say that there were people who could hear the voices of the ancestors in the beat of the drums. And she said, maybe you are one of those people. And so that's where the title came from, Drums in Our Veins, right? And I've come to understand that those drums are not just about African drums. I met a woman the other day who told me, she whispered to me, she said, my ancestors, she said, are from Ireland, and they too speak through the drums. That there's something to be said about the rhythms of our lives, how those show up, and how they inform and connect us both to the past, the present, and the future.
I too have been on a sort of a self-discovery journey and discovering my own authentic self. I think in many ways I have separated myself from Korean spirituality because I have long associated that with exclusion or more perhaps some patriarchal systems. But recently I found myself deconstructing that and separating those apart and saying, what are some of those rhythms that are deeply rooted in my own veins, in my Korean heritage, the kind of Korean spirituality that is distinct. That's something I'm exploring, and I don't know what that looks like just yet, but I deeply resonate with that journey, what you're just sharing as well. What are some of those beats, those drums, those rhythms rooted in Korean spirituality? So thank you.
A lot of people who are in ministry will find themselves at some point in what we call a cross-racial or cross-cultural appointment. What advice would you give to folks who are navigating the balance of authenticity and also sometimes a subversive racism, ageism, sexism that exists within a lot of our churches? How would you help them navigate holding tension to be authentic and truly who you are in spaces that maybe are not super welcoming to that?
Well, let me tell you about my first church, my first call, where the congregation was 100% white. And I was the only person of color who showed up. And I have congregational pictures from my time at that church where the Black people in the picture were my family. Okay, so there was more than one. It was members of my family who had showed up on a particular day. I would say the first thing and the first piece of advice I would give is do not be afraid. And the reason I start there is that for many of us who are starting out new in ministry, we want to be successful. We want to pay off those student loans. And we're afraid of losing our jobs if we say the wrong thing, or we don't show up the way that people want us to show up, right? I want to tell you that the Bible says God does not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. The second thing I would say is it doesn't matter where you serve in ministry. The call is to be yourself. So going in.
Say that one more time. Whoa, I think I need to hear that again.
The call is to be yourself. We're almost coming like full circle on this conversation, right?
That's right.
The call is to be yourself. You're not called to be the pastor who was there before. You're not called to be the pastor down the street. You're called to be in that church and in that space. And I want to say that your authenticity has to show up when you walk in the door for that search committee. It cannot show up on the first day that you show up to preach. You should walk into every interview process as yourself, fully grounded, right? Fully knowing that where you are is where you need to be, and that where you are or where you end up is where God has called you to be. And I would also say that where you end up, believe that you are prepared. We always have things that we need to learn, but I believe that God prepares us for where we are going. And if we could hold on to those things, I think we would have less angst. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but it would be less anxiety producing for us because we could hold on to ourselves. Quite often, where we become burdened is we find ourselves in places in ministry and we find that we are losing ourselves in order to maintain whatever it is that people think they want from us. And we start losing ourselves. We don't have the desire for the things that we used to. We're de-energized. We're tired. We're experiencing the toxicity. And it burdens us. It fries us out. During the pandemic. And shortly as we're moving out of, the kind of pandemic experience, there were so many people who left the church, who left as clergy. And that was because we all, regardless of what it was that we thought ministry was going to be, we all turned into YouTube content generators. We were producers of music, right? We suddenly have to figure out licensing. We had to figure out how to produce on Zoom, right? And how to set up a background and rooms. And it was too much. And I think some of us figured out it wasn't our thing, right? We understood ministry in a certain way. And unfortunately, we were burnt out when we left, right? So I think we have to be able to say and to see, this is my season. So coming front and center to the conversation, right? My season is up, and being able to walk away with our dignity and in full command of our self-respect, rather
Oh,
than waiting until we are so burnt out that we have lost ourselves. We have lost our integrity. We've lost our authenticity. We've lost our passion and our drive before we say, hey, I'm willing to leave. So your season is your season, and you are the only person who can determine what your season is. And I want to tell you that your season is not determined by the contract that you have signed with the church or with that entity. Your season is determined by the presence and power of the Holy Spirit. And we need to be willing to listen and discern what the Spirit is saying to us.
the light bulb moment that went off in my head was two things. One was that, we mourn, we often look at the numbers of clergy who, let's say, stepped away from ministry during the pandemic. And we say, oh, this is so terrible. But perhaps there are among those numbers individuals who were self-aware and said, this is the end of my season and God is doing something new. And so there are probably folks we should be celebrating with. And the other thing that, definitely lands for me is, again, we talk about clergy burnout and how common that was. That was something that even existed before the pandemic, and we're seeing it even these days. And, we are taught about self-care and how to take breaks and how to rest. But what I'm hearing from our conversation today is, taking Sabbath is important, resting is important, but above all, how are we being our authentic selves in the midst of ministry? And also discerning, have I overstayed this place, or, what is the season that I'm living in right now that God is living with me right now? Those are the two things that really stick out to me.
Yeah, no, these are the conversations we absolutely have to be having. And I wish, Dr. Thompson, that somebody had said the things you said about starting a new appointment, and we call them appointments in the United Methodist Church. But I wish somebody had told me that it's okay to be authentic, and that God called me and not anybody else and any other virgin to this space and this time in this season. And I think that that's really important. And I hope folks are hearing this and are inviting themselves to a new conversation about what it looks like to be in ministry, especially in this new season of the church, as we come out of the pandemic and as we figure out who we're going to be for the next 50, 100, 150 years. And I think that's really important. So thank you.
Amen. All right. Well, Dr. Thompson, I'm so thankful for you and carving out just time from your busy schedule to talk with us. We do have one last question that we ask all of our guests. We are the Uncovered Dish podcast because we love covered dish dinners. As Methodists, we love food. And so here's our last question for you. If you could only have one dish, one meal for the rest of your life, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, no variations, what would that one dish be?
I think it would have to be like a really nice fried snapper, head on with lots of pepper. In our Jamaican culture, we do what we call escovitch fish, which to escovitch you use like hot peppers in vinegar. You could add like carrots and to it as well. And so you cook that after you fry the fish dry, and then you pour that mixture of vinegar and peppers and pimento and other spices over the fish. So yeah, that's where I would go.
Whoa.
And now I'm hungry.
Deep fried snapper. Where do you get one? Where would you get one if this is your craving?
Okay, so it would depend on where you live. If I were in New York City, which I don't live in New York City anymore, you could literally go to like the fish store, like in my sister's neighborhood. There's a fish store on the corner. You go in and you can order a nice fresh red snapper head on, and take that home, season it up nicely, fry it, and do all those other things that I said with it. Yes. Makes for a wonderful meal.
Dr. Thompson,
Yes.
whenever you're back in New York, we'd love to share in that meal. Once again, thank you so much for coming and sharing and inspiring us. I hope it was inspiring also for the listeners as well. And if folks wanted to reach out to you or learn more about the United Church of Christ, where can they connect with you or connect with the church?
Okay, so the United Church of Christ, our website is ucc.org. And you can find me on all the social media platforms. So I think I still have an account on X. I have an Instagram, which is Karen _Georgia. And on Facebook, I actually have 2 Facebook pages. One is KG Thompson, which is a personal page, and Karen Georgia Thompson, which is actually my UCC page that I tend to use for more deeply spiritual things. On a lot of those, I also post my poetry. And so that can be found there as well. And my book of poetry can be found probably on most platforms as well, electronically or in a real book.
Awesome. Yes, definitely. For our listeners out there, please go pick up a book, Drum in Our Veins by the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson. Dr. Thompson, thank you again for coming out and sharing with us. We are inspired and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.